Hi, what we are looking at today is how to make salts. And before we actually do that, this is one of the typical 6-mark questions on a GCSE paper, where they will ask you how you make a particular salt and where you'll have to identify the acid and the base and go through the procedure. But before we do that, let's have a look at this quick retrieval. Make sure you have an understanding of independent variables, dependent variables, and the other variable is the control variable. Now don't forget, the independent variable is the variable that you determine, you decide before the investigation. The dependent variable is what you measure during the investigation. Number 3 is a typical GCSE question. What would you use to measure a certain volume of hydrochloric acid? What piece of apparatus do we use to measure volumes of any liquid? Okay. Well, I hope you've got a measuring cylinder. Okay. Number 4, if we want to use the same sized piece of magnesium each time, what piece of equipment would help us? So here, use a ruler, can't you? And then number 5, what type of reaction would produce a salt? Okay, well, it's a neutralization reaction. So that's a quick retrieval. Let's move on. Okay, so required practical, making a salt. And we are going to make a soluble salt. Now, instead of a match a picture, what I want you to do, please, pause the video here and list the apparatus you think we will need when making a salt. You can pause the video here. Okay. Well, you'd certainly need a conical flask. Measuring cylinder. Measuring volumes. Possibly a ruler or a balance to measure the mass of the base. Make sure it's fair. Evaporating dish. Funnel. Filter paper. Gauze. Bunsen burner. Spatula. Now let's have a look at this then. How do we do this? These are some of the words that you need to talk about, you need to know something about. So I'll pause this video here and have a look at these words and write down something about an acid, a base, an alkali, an insoluble salt, a soluble salt, a neutralization. Go ahead, pause the video here. Okay, let's have a look at this then. Acid, well, it's opposite to an alkali. Acid will neutralize an alkali. Acid has a pH range of between 1 and 6. And acids contain the ion H+. Number 2, base. Base will neutralize an acid. It's a metal oxide. Yeah, base is a metal oxide. It will neutralize an acid. Number 3, alkali. Alkali belongs to the family of bases. So an alkali will also neutralize an acid. And alkali is something that dissolves in water. It's a solution. Whereas a base is not. A base is going to be a solid. An insoluble salt is a salt made during a chemical reaction, and the salt is insoluble. It's normally in the form of a precipitate, and you simply filter it off, and then you can dry it. A soluble salt is a salt made during neutralisation, where you need to evaporate half the volume of water and let crystals appear. And the neutralisation is a reaction between an acid and an alkali to produce a salt and water. Or base. Okay, so moving on. So here we go. We've got in here, in the beaker, we've got an acid, which is gently warmed. And what you do, you put in the base. Here's the base, the metal oxide. And you stir with a glass rod. And you continue doing that until there is excess copper oxide in the beaker. Pause this video, and why do you think when there's excess copper oxide in the beaker, what is inside that beaker? Pause the video here and think about this one. Okay. What you should have in the beaker then, the reason why there's excess copper oxide is because all the acid has been neutralised. So what you should have in the beaker is the soluble salt, the water, and the excess or unreacted copper oxide. Now we need to get rid of the copper oxide. We do not need the excess copper oxide. So what do you think we should do here? Well, let's have a look. We then filter it. You filter the excess copper oxide, and you have the filtrate. Now the filtrate will be the soluble salt and the water. So the acid has been neutralised, the base has done its job, and we now have the filtrate. So how do we get the salt from the filtrate? Pause the video here. Okay, well, let's have a look. You evaporate. And what we do, you evaporate, you put the filtrate in the evaporating dish, and you evaporate to half the volume, then switch the Bunsen off and let it cool down. And what you should see, you see crystals appearing. And if it is copper sulfate, you'll see blue crystals appearing. Okay. So here's a little task for you. Write down a method to explain what you would need to make the salt magnesium chloride. But here's the key. You'll need to include the acid and the metal oxide. Okay. Now, I am hoping that you have made the salt copper sulfate. And when you made the copper sulfate, that was the base and that was the acid. So what you need to think about, which acid produces chloride salts, and what's the metal oxide going to be called? So you can pause the video here and have a go. Don't forget, we've just gone through the method of making a salt. This will be a typical 6-mark question. The acid you should have should be hydrochloric acid. And the base, metal oxide, to produce magnesium oxide, it can be it's magnesium oxide. Okay, if we move on then. Let's have a go at a few exam questions. Here's a 1 mark question. Which ion is found in all acids? Tick 1 box. And then B, zinc nitrate can be produced by reacting an acid and a metal oxide. Name the acid and the metal oxide for 2 marks. Have a go at this. Well, let's have a look. Okay. The ion is H+. And let's look at B. The acid is nitric acid, or HNO3, and the metal oxide will be zinc oxide, or ZNO. Moving on. Pause the video here again. In an equation, zinc nitrate is written as there. What does AQ mean? Tick 1 box. Okay, let's see if you got this one right. Dissolved in water. Okay? Dissolved in water. Moving on. A student plans a method to prepare pure crystals of copper sulfate. The student's method is add 1 spatula of calcium carbonate to dilute hydrochloric acid in a beaker. When the fizzing stops, heat the solution with a Bunsen burner until all the liquid is gone. The method contains several errors and does not produce copper sulfate crystals. Explain the improvements a student should make to the method so that pure crystals of copper sulfate are produced. Pause the video here. Okay, let's have a look. That's the answers here. Use of sulfuric acid and not hydrochloric acid. The salt needed was copper sulfate, so the acid had to be sulfuric acid. Use copper carbonate and not calcium carbonate. The salt again was copper sulfate. Number 3, add solid until solid remains or is in excess, like we have discussed. And then you filter to remove the excess, copper carbonate or copper oxide. And then the final step. Now that's a possible 5 mark question now. Moving on. And that's the end of this neutralisation reaction practical.